Today we're looking at Betsy Ross and the American flag. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. Today's Bellringer deals with a historic topic that there's some controversy concerning, and that is Betsy Ross and the first American flag. Now, there is some evidence that Betsy Ross did in fact sew the first American flag in 1776. However, the story of George Washington and others approaching Ross to make the flag, and if in fact this was the first flag, is something that is up for debate. And in fact, it wasn't until 1870 that Betsy Ross's grandson shared the story of his grandmother and the first flag. Nonetheless, there is no doubt that Betsy Ross was an American patriot and did produce flags for the American cause. Betsy Ross was born Elizabeth Griscom in a Quaker family in Philadelphia on January 1st, 1752. As she grew up, she became an apprentice to William Webster, who ran an upholstery business. Now, today when we think of upholstery, we think of simply it just being covering furniture. But in the 1700s, an upholsterer would sew together almost anything: blinds, mattresses, and flags. In 1773, at the age of 21, she married John Ross, and they started their own upholstery business. Now, after their marriage, Betsy and John attended Christ Church in Philadelphia, where, ironically, George Washington also attended church and actually sat just a few pews away from them. So Washington knew of the Rosses and their upholstery business. Just a few years later, as the American Revolution was beginning, John Ross volunteered for the militia and he died. Actually, he would be the first of 3 husbands that Betsy had that would die. So now Betsy was a widow running her own business. Now we come to the story of how many argue Ross sewed the first flag. According to Betsy, in late May of 1776, a committee of representatives from the Continental Congress that included George Washington, who of course was the commander-in-chief, or the commander of the Continental Army, Robert Morris, who was a wealthy, well-known landowner, and George Ross, who was actually her late husband John Ross's uncle, came to visit her shop. And it's said that Washington showed Betsy a rough design with 13 stripes alternating white and red, and then a circle of 13 stars to represent a new constellation of stars in the sky. In this design, Washington had each star having 6 points, but it is said that Ross then demonstrated to Washington how simple it would be to cut out a star with 5 points by folding the cloth and doing a quick single cut. So the stars were changed to 5-point stars instead. At the time when this committee visited Ross, the Continental Congress had not yet begun to debate declaring independence from Britain, but everyone had an idea that it was probably coming. Also, Washington had just successfully captured Boston after a long siege. During the siege of Boston, Washington had used a flag called the Grand Union flag, which had the 13 stripes, but also featured the British Union Jack. After the capture of Boston, full separation from Britain began to appear much more likely, and so Washington wanted a new flag that signified this new nation that was forming. According to Betsy Ross, she completed sewing the flag in late May or early June of 1776, shortly before the Declaration of Independence was issued. On June 14, 1777, the Continental Congress officially recognized or made official the national flag. As the war continued, Betsy Ross remained in Philadelphia and would actually have British troops quartered in her home while the British occupied Philadelphia. Despite this, she kept her upholstery shop open throughout the entire war and actually continued to support the American cause by sewing cloth pouches for the Continental Army. During the war, her second husband, Joseph Ashburn, whom she had married in June of 1777, died while in a British prison. And then in 1783, she married John Claypool, and together they had 5 daughters. After the Revolution was over, Betsy Claypool, as she was known now, and her daughters continued a successful business that was really known for making flags. Shortly before the War of 1812, she and her daughters sewed an 18-foot by 24-foot flag to be sent to New Orleans, which undoubtedly might have been there at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. But her husband, John Claypool, died in 1817, but she continued working at her upholstery business until 1827, when she retired and moved north of Philadelphia to live with one of her daughters. Betsy died on January 30th, 1836 at the age of 84. Betsy Ross's story is just one one of many historic accounts of the first flag being created. There is not necessarily concrete evidence to conclusively support any one of them, including the story of Betsy Ross, but there's no doubt that Betsy Ross did create flags, and Ross did help support the American cause and aided in the young nation creating an identity. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.